In late July, a hedge fund managing as much as $45 billion, run by a 25-year-old former researcher who had turned a starting investment of just $225 million into one of the most talked about funds on Wall Street, lost 77% of its value in a matter of days. Not over a year, not over a bad quarter. Days, and the specific reason it happened is something you need to understand clearly, because it is not really a story about one young manager making a mistake. It is a story about exactly the kind of risk sitting quietly inside a huge number of ordinary retirement accounts right now, including possibly your own, without a single dollar of leverage anywhere in sight. Here is the twist, and I am giving it to you immediately instead of making you wait, because it is the detail almost nobody explaining this story gets right. The fund's core investment thesis was not actually wrong. The specific stocks it held concentrated in companies building the physical infrastructure behind artificial intelligence, recovered a real portion of their losses, somewhere between 27 and 41%, within just 3 trading sessions after the fund was forced to sell everything. Read that carefully. The fund was not destroyed because it bet on the wrong thing. It was destroyed because it bet on that thing using borrowed money, up to 4 times leverage, which meant it could not survive a temporary ordinary market pullback long enough to be right. Being correct about the future and surviving long enough to benefit from being correct are 2 completely different problems. And this fund solved the first one and failed catastrophically at the second. Before I go further, I want to know who is with me right now. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and tell me honestly whether you have any idea how much of your own retirement account is currently concentrated in the same handful of technology companies driving this entire story. I read these, and I promise you the pattern in the comments under a video like this always reveals how few people have actually checked that number for themselves. Let me walk through exactly what happened, because the sequence itself is a genuine lesson in how quickly leverage can turn a real, correct idea into a disaster. The fund, called Situational Awareness, was founded in late 2024 with roughly $225 million. By mid-2026, driven by leverage reaching as high as 4 times its actual capital, it had grown to as much as $45 billion in assets, posting a return of 439% in the first half of this year alone, cumulative returns exceeding 9,000% since it started. On July 24th, with the broader semiconductor sector already sliding, the fund's manager wrote to investors describing the pullback as a rare opportunity, even suggesting it was a good time to add more money. 6 days later, the math caught up. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index had fallen roughly 24% from its June peak, and the fund's concentrated positions in specific AI infrastructure companies fell even harder than the broader index, between 27 and 54%, depending on the specific holding. Because the fund was leveraged up to 4 times its actual capital, those losses were magnified severely, triggering margin calls from 3 of its prime brokers, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Bank of America, banks that had lent the fund money against its positions, and now demanded it be repaid immediately as those positions lost value. With no way to meet those calls, other than selling, the fund was forced to liquidate its entire public equity portfolio, roughly $16 billion worth, in one of the largest rushed sales in recent Wall Street history. Most of it purchased by Citadel at discounts, reportedly running from 20 to 50% below, where those positions had been valued just days earlier. If you are finding this useful already, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because the next part explains why this specific story matters so much to an ordinary retirement saver who has never used a dollar of leverage in their life. And it is the part that connects directly to your own account, whether you realize it or not. Here is why this reaches beyond one spectacular blowup. The broader pattern this fund's collapse exposed extreme concentration in a small handful of companies tied to the artificial intelligence build-out, is not confined to leveraged hedge funds. It runs directly through the ordinary index funds that make up the core of most standard retirement accounts. As a small number of technology companies tied to AI infrastructure have grown to represent an increasingly outsized share of major stock market indexes, an investor who believes they are holding a broadly diversified fund is, in reality, holding a portfolio far more concentrated in this single theme than they likely realize. You do not need $1 of borrowed money to be exposed to concentration risk. You simply need your supposedly diversified retirement account to be quietly weighted more heavily than you think toward the exact handful of companies this fund's collapse revealed to be far more fragile, at least in the short term, than their headline growth stories suggested. There is a historical echo here worth knowing, because this exact pattern, extreme leverage on a concentrated, directionally correct idea, unwinding violently the moment prices move against it, even briefly, has happened before. And it tends to happen at moments when a story feels too obviously true to bet against. The collapse of Archegos Capital in 2021 followed a remarkably similar shape, a concentrated leveraged position that was not necessarily wrong about the companies it held, undone specifically by leverage rather than by a flawed original idea. Long-term capital management in 1998 followed a version of the same pattern decades earlier. The lesson across all of these episodes is not that the underlying thesis was foolish. It is that leverage turns an ordinary survivable pullback into a forced, unrecoverable liquidation. And the more obviously correct an idea feels to everyone at the same time, the more leverage tends to pile into it, which is exactly what makes the eventual unwind so violent when it finally comes. Let me make this real with two people, because none of this matters until you see how it lands in an actual life. Neither is real, but both are the kind of person you might recognize. The first I will call Percival 70, who has never used leverage in his life and would never dream of it, and who assumes that because his retirement account sits in a standard, well-known index fund, he is automatically protected from exactly the kind of concentration that just destroyed a $45 billion hedge fund in 6 days. He has never actually opened his own account statement to check what percentage of his supposedly diversified holdings sits concentrated in the small handful of companies at the center of this exact story. The second person I will call Wilhelmina, 68, and she took the time, after hearing about this collapse, to actually check her own retirement account's real composition. Rather than assuming the word diversified on her statement meant what it used to mean, she found that a meaningful share of her own index fund exposure was concentrated in the same handful of companies. This story revolves around, not through any leverage of her own, but simply through how those companies have come to dominate the indexes millions of ordinary retirement accounts are built around. She did not panic or make any dramatic change, but she did use that information to think more deliberately about whether a portion of her own savings belongs somewhere genuinely uncorrelated to that specific concentration risk. Percival assumed the word diversified protected him. Wilhelmina checked and found the word meant less than she had always assumed. The difference between them was never how much either one had saved. It was that one of them trusted a label on a statement and one of them actually looked underneath it. Now, why do so many careful, intelligent people end up like Percival, trusting that a standard, widely recommended index fund automatically means real diversification? There is a simple, well-documented reason. The word diversified carries an implicit sense of safety, and most people reasonably assume that a fund tracking hundreds of companies must, by definition, spread risk broadly across all of them. What that assumption misses is that many popular indexes are weighted by company size, which means that as a small handful of companies grow dramatically larger than the rest, exactly what has happened with the AI infrastructure theme, they come to represent a rapidly growing share of the entire fund, even though the fund still technically holds hundreds of other names. The investors who catch this shift early are rarely the ones with access to special information. They are simply the ones willing to open their own statement and check the actual concentration for themselves, rather than trusting a single reassuring word to describe it accurately. Now, let me be careful and honest with you, because I will not insult you with fear. And this exact subject draws people who want to frighten or excite you into a rushed decision. This one, fund's collapse, does not mean the broader AI investment theme is fundamentally wrong. And in fact, the specific holdings at the center of this story partially recovered within days of the forced sale, suggesting the underlying idea retained real value even after the leveraged version of the bet failed. It also does not mean every technology-heavy index fund is dangerously concentrated, or that gold and silver are a complete substitute for equity exposure in a well-built retirement plan. Gold and silver carry their own real volatility and their own real risks, and simply owning them does not eliminate risk from a portfolio. It changes what kind of risk you are carrying. Anyone telling you this one story proves a single asset is the obvious answer to every kind of market risk is overselling you a simplicity that does not exist in genuinely well-built financial planning. What I am giving you is not a reason to abandon diversified investing. It is a genuine, well-documented case study in how concentration can hide inside a portfolio that carries the label diversified, and a reason to actually check your own specific exposure rather than assuming a familiar word on your statement tells you the whole story. I want to say a word about gold and silver here, specifically, because this is precisely the kind of risk they have historically served to offset. Neither metal depends on the earnings, the leverage, or the concentration risk sitting inside any single sector or theme, artificial intelligence or otherwise. When a story like this one plays out, a violent, leverage-driven unwind inside one of the market's most crowded trades, an asset that sits genuinely outside that specific risk, answering to none of the same pressures, is exactly the kind of counterweight a thoughtfully built plan is designed to include, not as a replacement for the rest of your portfolio, but as something that moves for entirely different reasons than the concentration risk. This story just exposed so dramatically. So let us pull this together and go back to where we started. A fund that turned $225 million into $45 billion, built on a directionally reasonable thesis about artificial intelligence infrastructure, lost 77% of its value in 6 days. Not because the underlying idea was wrong, but because 4 times leverage on a concentrated position could not survive an ordinary 24% pullback in its sector long enough to be proven right. The same underlying concentration that destroyed this fund sits, unlevered, but still real, inside a huge number of ordinary retirement accounts built around standard index funds. And the difference between the people who understand their own real exposure and the people who do not comes down to one habit: actually checking what your own supposedly diversified account is concentrated in, rather than trusting a single reassuring word to describe it accurately. Here is what I want you to carry away from this, stated as plainly as I know how. This is not a call to panic about your own retirement account, and it is not a call to abandon equities or index investing, because those tools remain genuinely valuable parts of a well-built plan. It is a call to actually check how concentrated your own specific holdings have become in a handful of companies tied to a single dominant theme, and to understand that an asset genuinely uncorrelated to that specific concentration risk, gold and silver among them, plays a real, well-understood role in a thoughtfully diversified plan precisely because it does not rise or fall based on the same leverage, the same margin calls, or the same crowded positioning that just took apart a $45 billion fund in less than a week. Whether that changes anything about your own plan depends entirely on your own circumstances, your own timeline, and your own comfort with risk. And I am not here to tell you the number. I am here to make sure you actually check your own real exposure instead of trusting a label to do that work for you. Do not let anyone use this story to rush you into a costly decision today, because there will be people trying, and they get louder every time a collapse this dramatic gets attention. And do not dismiss it either. telling yourself that a leveraged hedge fund's collapse could not possibly say anything about your own unlevered retirement account, because you just watched exactly how the same underlying concentration, without a single dollar of borrowed money involved, sits quietly inside a huge share of ordinary, widely recommended index funds today. Those are two different mistakes, and the sensible path sits calmly between them. None of this is financial advice. Every figure I have referenced, the fund's peak assets, its leverage level, the percentage decline, the specific banks issuing margin calls, comes directly from reporting by the Wall Street Journal, CNBC, and Forbes on this exact collapse, so you can verify every word of it yourself rather than take mine. I opened by telling you that a fund managing $45 billion lost 77% of its value in 6 days, and that the real lesson has almost nothing to do with one young manager's judgment. Now you understand exactly why. A directionally reasonable idea, destroyed not by being wrong, but by leverage that could not survive an ordinary pullback long enough to be right, sitting on top of a broader concentration risk that runs quietly through a huge number of ordinary unlevered retirement accounts right now. So let me leave you with the question underneath all of it. If a $45 billion fund run by sophisticated professionals could be wiped out this fast by concentration, it never fully priced for how confident are you that you actually know how concentrated your own account has quietly become? And have you ever really checked